Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the greatest games on the Blizzard. My name is Marcus Speller. Jonathan Wilson is here, of course. And today in the pod, we have Saša Ibrulj, football writer, a columnist for Telesport and contributor to The Guardian, World Soccer, ESPN, and many, many others. Saša, an absolute pleasure to have you in the pod.
Pleasure is all mine, boys. Thank you for having me.
Not at all. Today, we've got a 1990 World Cup quarter-final between Yugoslavia and Argentina, with Argentina going through 3-2 on penalties after a goalless 120 minutes. Saša, why have you chosen this game?
Well, in a way, I did not choose this game. It chose me. Not just for the fact that it's one of the first football memories that I have, but because it's one of the last that Yugoslavia actually played, or the last match that Yugoslavia played at the major tournaments. So it's one of those games that could have had a huge impact, and in that terms, it gained a legendary status in the Balkans or in the Bosnia, at least. This Yugoslav side was picked by Ivica Osim, who was a Bosnian. It contained several Bosnian players, and something like that was not possible in previous years, in 60s, 70s, or 80s. So this game came in the most difficult moment for the country. The country was falling apart. The league was falling apart. The clubs were getting out of the league. So everything was in chaos. So this was a sort of a transcendental moment. This quarterfinal was sort of a transcendental moment because after Yugoslavia beat Spain in last 16, or after that, people just started to care again about football and about Yugoslavian team, and it happened all of a sudden, out of nothing. So yeah, this game is a large part of my life and large part of what happened before and after the game in Yugoslavia, or countries that were made after Yugoslavia was collapsed.
Yeah. I mean, Jonathan, is obviously an awful lot of politics wrapped up in this one, but there's an awful lot of quality football and footballers as well. I mean, that Yugoslavia side, I know you're a fan of one or two of the names at least.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably not quite as good as the team that would have played at the Euros. I mean, they qualified for the Euros, of course, and then weren't allowed to take part because the war had begun. But yeah, you look at that team, and Dragan Stojkovic obviously was the big star, and that game against Spain was his sort of defining game. That I think probably his greatest game in the Yugoslavia shirt, but also the game that really announced to the world this is a really, really great talent. And of course, he gets to move to Marseille, partly on the back of that. But also you had a young Poznanski in midfield. You had Savicevic coming off the bench. So it's that core of that sort of great imagined Yugoslavia team of the 90s. But as Saša says, with actually a lot of Bosnian names in there as well. And Ivica Osim, I think one of the great coaches that people don't really think of. I mean, he was twice approached by Real Madrid and he twice turned them down. And I interviewed him, I think it must have been 2011. Saša, do you remember this? I think it was that Turkey game, the Bosnia-Turkey game. Was that qualified for Euro 2012?
My brain just stops, but it can be something like that. Yeah.
It
was 1-1 with Salihovic late goal. I think we met on that game.
Yeah, I think that is. Yeah. So I think this was the day after that. And Osim had been very early. He'd had the stroke when he was Japan manager, sort of 3 or 4 years earlier. And I'd been trying to speak to him. And
sorry to interrupt you, but it must be 2009 then, because I think that was World Cup 2010 qualifying, because it was under Ciro Blažević, and he was in that campaign.
Yeah, you're right. It was definitely Blažević, because I remember Osim talking about Blažević. So it was 2009 or 2011. So I've been trying to speak to Osim, and he'd had a stroke when he was Japan manager a couple of years earlier, and he was still recovering. And his wife was very protective of him and kept on sort of fobbing me off. I mean, totally reasonably. I mean, he was ill. And then on the day I was leaving Sarajevo, she decided that he was well enough to speak, and so met him in a cafe by his house and had the most extraordinary 2 hours as he talked. I mean, he talked about a huge number of things, but this game in particular, and he was explaining the sort of political pressures on him, that there was sort of this, to start with, was a sort of unofficial quota system where he had to make sure he picked a player from each of the 6 constituent republics of Yugoslavia, and it wasn't anything formal, but he knew if he didn't pick somebody from, say, Slovenia or Croatia, it would be a huge problem. But then he said specifically Saša Ibrulj, the Slovenian, the defensive midfielder, whose mother was Croatian. Is that correct?
Something like that.
And he'd been threatened, or his family had been threatened, that if he played in this game, his family were going to be attacked back in Ljubljana. And so he pulled out of the game. I don't know what difference that makes to the result, but it's clearly a very, very difficult circumstance if the player who should have played at the back of the midfield is being taken out of the side for reasons that have nothing to do with football at all.
Basically, the most important quote from Ivica Osim, not just for this game but the whole World Cup, is the fact that he said that he believes that if Yugoslavia won this game or potentially won the World Cup, things could have been much different.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you exactly what he said to me. Yeah, I'll read this out. Maybe I'm optimistic, but in my private illusion, I wonder what would have happened if Yugoslavia had played in the semi-final or the final. What would have happened in the country? Maybe there would have been no war if we won the World Cup. I don't think things would have changed in that way, but sometimes you dream about what might have happened.
I completely agree. I don't believe that things would be different in terms of Yugoslavia collapsing. But what may have been different is the bloodbath that happened. I mean, maybe some of the extent of the war could be a bit different, or things, or the country could dissolve in a completely different way.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the history of Yugoslavia is something that people don't really know that much about in Britain. Older generations will know a tiny bit, but it's such an explosive piece of history, in Europe not that long ago. And to get one's head around it, if you're not from there, is very, very difficult. And often things are kind of missaid and misspoken about it. But in that World Cup, I mean, you mentioned that after the Spain game in the second round, there was suddenly this, people were interested. Were people, due to the political situation, were people not that interested going into the World Cup in Yugoslavia, Saša?
Well, it was not just the politics. Obviously, the politics were a huge part, because from the late 80s, the things were getting worse in Yugoslavia. And Maksimir already happened in 1990, when that Dinamo Crvena Zvezda match.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's worth to just give a context of that. So this is the famous game where Dinamo Zagreb are playing Zvezda, playing Red Star, and you have Boban kicking the policeman and the riot. And that happened on the 13th of May. So that's 6 weeks before this game?
Something like that.
So
that's why Boban was not taken to the World Cup. He was suspended by the Football Federation. And all these were reasons for many not to follow the national team. And then that friendly against the Netherlands in Zagreb happened just a couple of days before the World Cup. That was like the last friendly match before they moved to Italy. And more than 20,000 people were cheering for the Netherlands and booing the national anthem, and things just looked terrible. But that was not the only reason. There were football reasons as well, because Ivica Osim took over the national team in 1986, and Yugoslavia missed 1986 World Cup and then 1988 Euros after losing to England at home 4-0. They were 4-0 down after 25 minutes. At that point in 1988, everyone thought that Osim will be sacked, and he was criticized a lot in public, in media, among the players, even the players who played the World Cup. Savicevic was heavily criticizing for not calling him up or playing him in the qualifiers. So the things were much more complicated than just the politics. And when Yugoslavia played Germany at San Siro in the first match, they lost 4-1.
Oh, it was a terrible start, yeah.
It was a terrible match, terrible start, and the whole public turned against Ivica Osim once again. Watching at that from today's perspective, when we consider Ivica Osim as one of the best coaches in the history of former Yugoslavia, at that time he was considered as a total idiot, if I can use that word, because he was criticized for his team selection. At the time, Mihailovic, Panchev, Savicevic, Prosinecki, they were all flourishing, but he played Sušić, who was 35, I think, at the time. He played Hadžibegić, who was a Bosnian. He played Bajdarevic, who was a Bosnian. So Vujovic from Split, who was 30-something, 34, I think. So he was called a dinosaur. He was called all the different names. And after the Germany match, what happened is that legendary story, or at least in Yugoslavia, that's a legendary story that was published in one of the papers that said that he and his coaching team drank 11 bottles of whiskey a night before the match. So after that Germany match, and after that headline, after that piece in Yugoslav papers, he and the whole team cut all the connections with the media. And back home, everyone is just hating the team and Ivica Osim as their coach.
But Osim, he's Bosnian, am I right in saying?
Yeah, he was born in Sarajevo. He was raised in Sarajevo.
Yeah. So was he accused of favouring players from that part of the former Yugoslavia?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, because in 60s, 70s, and 80s, he was the first Bosnian coach who was in sole manager position, because before that we had something called managerial commissions with 4 different coaches, and there were some Bosnians among them, but Ivica Osim was the first to take the team by himself. And he was, just a couple of days before the World Cup, he was accused of favoring Bosnians, of some of the players buying their place in the team, like they bought a flat at the seaside for him just to be involved in a World Cup squad and things like that. So yes, he was heavily criticized and heavily accused of different things like that just before the World Cup and during the World Cup.
Jonathan, when you were speaking to Osim and you look at it, how do you think he tried to kind of get on with it in a footballing sense? Because obviously, we now speak about him very favourably, but yet, as Saša's mapped out, failed qualifications and an awful opening game to the start of the 1990 World Cup.
Yeah, I mean, this was nearly 20 years later when he was talking about it. But you sort of sense his frustration. I mean, the other phrase he used that really stuck with me was he said, "This game was played at the wrong time." And I think his feeling was that if they played it in better circumstances, and meaning political and sporting, then he probably fancied his team. I mean, you've got to remember as well the situation of this Argentina team, that clearly the situation in Argentina was nowhere near as catastrophic as it was about to be in Yugoslavia. But Argentina had the junta had fallen in '83, but Alfonsín, who the first democratic president after the junta, he'd gone in '89 and been replaced by Menem, and Menem was this incredibly divisive figure who ran on a Peronist ticket but turned out to be essentially a Thatcherite, and he did all this ridiculous stuff of dressing like a gaucho, like a Cadisho leader, with all these big sideburns, wore a poncho. And he was, as hard and market driven as anybody. And so through '89, there'd been all these riots in Argentina. There'd been a huge debt crisis. So the situation there was very, very difficult. And then, of course, they go and lose to Cameroon in the first game of the World Cup. And Maradona's really good talking about leaving Milan that night. And the plane was delayed, and I'm sitting in the airport for what seemed like hours and hours and hours, just sort of thinking, the world is over. And then, on the plane, they had a sort of, real sort of thrash it out meeting. And Bilardo said, if we go home in the group stage, we're finished. We've got to at least get through this group. And so they had this sort of great sort of bonding experience of feeling the world was against them, which I guess was not dissimilar to what Yugoslavia had. And Argentina ended up getting through the group. They beat the USSR 2-0 with Maradona's third hand of God moment. His third in 4 years, where he punches a Kuznetsov flick off the line. He had one against England, and he had one in the UEFA Cup final for Napoli. And then they scrape a draw against Romania, and so they go through third in the group. And then that gets them a game against Brazil, which is one of the ridiculously is the greatest game in. Or it's still revered in Argentina way more than anything. Winning the World Cup when they absolutely gut Brazil, get battered from start to finish and nick it 1-0, and that's a game with the drugged water bottles and Caniggia's brilliant finish and Maradona's pass. And you look now at that goal, and you see the psychological hold Maradona had over Brazil, that he gets the ball, turns 40 yards from goal, and he's got Caniggia up with him. He's got a midfielder and 4 defenders, and they all just sort of
it's
into a clump.
Madness.
And Maradona's like, I'll just knock the ball into space and Caniggia can score.
Yeah, ridiculous. Yeah, and Caniggia, it wasn't like he was a bad player or nobody knew who he was, sort of thing.
Yeah, and in Brazil in 2014 at the World Cup, the Argentina fans were singing about that game. When Maradona vaccinated you, he's talking about specifically about that pass. They're not talking about winning the World Cup in 86 or 78. They're talking about this scabby 1-0 win. So Yugoslavia, they become sort of the next in this line of sort of opponents for Argentina, but they were fighting themselves as much as anybody, and they had this great unity, and they felt all of Italy was against them, and the crowd at San Siro for that first game had very much been on Cameroon's side because they hated Maradona so much in Milan, because obviously what he was doing with Napoli. And there were all kinds of incidents. I think it was actually after this game when Maradona's brother got stopped for speeding, and Maradona thought, this is part of... I mean, even though his brother was speeding, thought, this is part of the conspiracy against me. And you look at videos of their camp, and they're having barbecues every day, and there's Maradona's dad on the asado kind of turning the meat. and you sort of sense the kind of the real spirit they had as a very much kind of, the rest of the world hates us, and we don't care. So the fact is, Yugoslavia, I don't think really bothered them who it was, but they did have that great sort of siege mentality.
But I think it was similar with Yugoslavia as well, especially after that whiskey story, because all the players all of a sudden were bonding and keeping their bosses back. So now instead of a team that was tearing apart, now they all of a sudden had a proper team, especially after the Spain match. And that was huge in terms of what happened 5 days before the World Cup.
Was there much animosity among the players in the Yugoslavia camp, Saša? Because from very different places, and as you said, you think about the game when Boban kicked the policeman and so on. A lot had been going on. Were the players themselves? Was there a little bit of ill feeling towards each other?
Well, yes and no. I mean, if you talk to any of the players from that time, he'll tell you that everything was perfect and they were all friends, and that nothing happened between them, and that's what history showed after the World Cup. I mean, they all left as a good friends, but the thing is, the history of Yugoslav football is it has some background in what you just asked. I mean, the conflicts between players that were coming from Partizan and Red Star, or from Dinamo and Hajduk, or top big four clubs, but also from the different republics. They were. It was not politics. It was not nationalism, but it was football. In footballing terms, the rivalry between Partizan and Red Star and Crvena Zvezda is so huge that it affected the national team, especially in the 60s and 70s. I've spoken to a couple of all the players, and they all say that, especially the players from Bosnia who were picked in those sides, because they felt as neutrals, but they felt also as someone who's not feeling like that's the place to be, because it was too much of the conflict between players coming from Partizan and Red Star and Crvena Zvezda.
All right, gentlemen, let's have a quick break and then we will talk about the match itself. See you in a moment, everybody. Welcome back to the greatest games on the Blizzard. Right then, let's talk a bit more about the football if we can, although I appreciate the other stuff is always there when we talk about this Yugoslavian side. So yes, they lost against West Germany. Well, they were hammered by West Germany in their opening game. They needed to beat a good Colombia side, and they did, 1-0, and it was the sweeper who got the goal, Josic, who scored against Germany. Perhaps an unlikely goal scorer, but they won that game, and then they won 4-1 against the United Arab Emirates. And in that 4-1 win, it felt like they were up and running, Saša, with Darko Panchev and Robert Prosinecki among the goals.
Well, yes, but to be honest, that match was considered to be like walk in the park because of what UEA was at the time in football terms. The Colombia match was much more important,
of course, yeah.
And the fact that the Bosnians scored a goal again was a big thing for Ivica Osim and his way of work with this national team. And the one thing that is important to highlight in that game is that they missed the penalty as well. Faruk Hadjibegic missed the penalty, and we'll come to that. He'll become a very important person in the match against the Argentinians. So yes, the things looked a bit better, but again against Colombia, Yugoslavia was not that good. I mean, they were okayish, but in what was expected back home in terms of playing beautiful football and winning games, it was not even close. And then, as I said before, the United Arab Emirates were just walk in the park and nothing else, nothing more than that. So it was just a chance to give youngsters a place to show their potential.
I mean, yeah, to back up your point about the United Arab Emirates, I think, Jonathan, if my memory serves me well, every goal scorer for the United Arab Emirates at that tournament got a Rolls Royce back home, something like that. But I mean, a 4-1 win is still a 4-1 win, good for a confidence booster. But we were beginning to see, a few more goals and so on, and see some of that attacking talent that Yugoslavia possessed.
The thing is, the match against Arab Emirates was basically used against Ivica Osim because that's the match where youngsters played very well, and the whole story in the media against him was that he's not using youngsters enough. So this was like slap in his face.
He can't win.
It was like, why don't you play these guys? Why do you play those old Bosnians in your side? We would win more matches.
Yeah,
and you got to remember as well that Yugoslavia won the Under-20 World Cup in 1987 in Chile with a team that was formed the basis of the Croatia side from '98. So you had Boban, you had Prosinecki, you had Predrag Mijatovic, obviously not Croatian. Robert Jarni was in that side, I think.
Well, Davor Šuker was in the squad for 1990. He didn't play, which I was quite surprised to see. Alan Boxic.
But these are all young players, so they're also 20, 21, 22. Yeah. Mikhailovic had been in the 87 side. So I guess there's that added pressure of, we know the next generation is really, really good. Why aren't you playing them? But you chucking a load of 20-year-olds into a World Cup isn't necessarily kind of going to win games. Yeah,
and also, Saša, as well, that the expectation, we should mention that Yugoslavia, I don't know whether they gave themselves this nickname or not, but they were the Brazilians of Europe, that people used to say about them. So a huge expectation.
Yeah,
and a style of play, an expected style of play as well.
Yeah, it was always like that. The Brazilians of Europe, but the fact is, they back from the 70s until the World Cup in Italy, they didn't do anything in the major tournaments. So this was like the expectations were always huge, but the delivery was poor. And this is again one of the reasons why the people were not that excited before the World Cup in Italy, because they were just disappointed with what happened in the last 20 years, and then they were disappointed that Ivica Osim was so stubborn and not playing these guys that won 1987 World Youth Championship in Chile. So yes, this was like Yugoslavia is on the edge when it comes to the future of the country, but it was also in between two very good generations, and Ivica Osim was in the middle, like the main figure.
Mm-hmm. So Jonathan, they get through the group. We mentioned the game against Spain, of course, but we shouldn't brush over that too much because, I mean, as you said, Dragan Stojkovic, a phenomenal player, scores two great goals, two very different goals, but two great goals in that game and gets everybody going. And for you, looking back at that tournament, do you think that was the game or the moment, if you like, that people sat up and took notice of Yugoslavia?
Yeah, I think so. Because I think, I don't know, but I mean, certainly to my 13-year-old brain, Yugoslavia were one of those sides who ever be talked about before tournaments who never did anything. Mm-hmm. And I actually think, I mean, okay, it's the last 16 game. It's never going to have the drama of being the West Germany semi-final. But I think there's a good argument actually that Spain-Yugoslavia game was the best game at Italia 90. It was a really, really good game of football. And Stojkovic is, I mean, I guess it's the sort of the last World Cup where playmakers of his ilk were central figures. I mean, maybe a little bit in 94, but yeah, you had him and you had Hadji and you had Maradona. And it sort of felt like every country had to have their great number 10.
Valderrama.
Valderrama, yeah. I mean, not England, obviously, because we don't do that kind of
no,
thing.
we don't mess around with that.
And yes, yeah. I think if you're 13 and a player from a country, I mean, okay, I'd been to Yugoslavia on holiday 5 times, so I knew something of Yugoslavia. But if a player from a country whose football you're not seeing regularly on TV makes a huge impression on you, as Stojkovic did on me in this tournament, and I think other people I was at school with. But Stojkovic just became one of those words that was designated a great footballer. So yeah, he had a huge impact, and that was a brilliant game, as you say. Two very different, but two brilliant goals.
And I think this game was the most important for the future of Ivica Osim as a manager, as a coach, and his legacy in Yugoslavia. Because all of a sudden, everything turned around. All of a sudden, people were celebrating him. All of a sudden, he was a modern coach who was able to mix youth and youth talent and veterans in his squad. All of a sudden, he was a tactical genius. And after what happened against Argentina and the fact that the country dissolved and the team dissolved, it just left as his legacy, as something that he did, and all of a sudden his philosophy was the most important in modern Yugoslav coaching history. So it was huge for him as well.
Yeah, it's classic football, isn't it? You're the villain one moment, and then suddenly it all kind of swings around, and you're the hero. I mean, they then get the quarterfinal against Argentina. Not a brilliant Argentina side, Jonathan. You've already sort of mentioned that, and they coughed and spluttered their way a little bit there, but they still had star quality themselves, for crying out loud.
Oh yeah, I mean, you look at the you had Juan Simon and Ruggieri, two of the back three, big names. Basualdo midfield. Burruchaga, Maradona, left over from 86. I mean, they lost Pompidou, the goalkeeper, in that game against the Soviet Union, and Goicoechea came in, which turned out, I think, to be a blessing for them.
One of the most significant sort of injuries, if you like, in any kind of tournament, you could argue. The fact is that Goicoechea came in and made such an impact. Yeah,
because he turned out to be a brilliant saver of penalties. And a very good goalkeeper. And it was their defence that team became based around, and it's still Bilardo's team. It still plays in that Bilardo way. They're still playing the back three. I mean, this is sort of two back threes meeting up. But yeah, they were. But it was just sort of a cynicism of that side that carried them through, and the sort of totally unapologetic cynicism. Yeah, they really relish being hated.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
but the strange thing about this game, I mean, I think I mentioned this to you before. But I remember sitting down to watch it in my house in Sunderland with my dad, and there was a power cut. And so we had to turn on the radio to try and get commentary. And it mustn't have been on BBC or something. I don't know why, but we ended up having to listen to a German commentary. And neither of us speak German. Well, I mean, I speak a bit of German now, but I didn't speak any German then. And so all we could do was kind of listen for the names and try and work out from the tone of voice what was going on. And so I think the power cut must have happened, I don't know, midway through the first half or something. Because I remember the penalty shootout quite clearly on the radio, because you could work that out very clearly from the crowd noise and the names. Yeah. And obviously, being English, with the legacy of 1986, we were both desperate for Yugoslavia, and having been to Yugoslavia so often, both of us, and having this sort of fondness for the country, we were both desperate for Yugoslavia to win. I just remember this very sad scene in this sort of suburban living room in Sunderland, of kind of me and my dad looking at the radio, cursing as the penalties were missed. Yeah,
it's funny actually. I mean, I can vividly remember watching this game as a sort of 7, nearly 8-year-old. Because there was no power cut in Edinburgh. It hadn't reached us where I was growing up. But yeah, I mean, amazing that it sort of, I suppose, ended 0-0 when you think of that sort of attacking talent. But then Italia 90, there wasn't.
But I think it was a terrible game. Trying to watch it back now and what I remember of it.
Yeah, it wasn't.
It seems to have been a genuinely awful game of football.
It depends on the perspective, because if you take the fact that Yugoslavia played for 90 minutes with 10 men.
Yes.
And they still managed to have a couple of great chances.
Mm-hmm. Sure, I mean, that clearly is the moment that turns the game, when Shabanadzovic, having already been booked, gets his second yellow card after 31 minutes.
Yeah, it was 31st minute, I think, and Maradona was in the middle with the ball, and he tried to catch him, but he was just faster than him, and he tripped him. It was clear second yellow, even though Yugoslavs they were surrounding the ref, and what was the part of the tradition at the time.
Fouling Maradona and also grabbing around the referee.
The fact is, there was a piece in LA Times that I found later where this journalist is writing that Maradona was the most fouled player at the World Cup before that match. And she is interviewing Refik Šabanađović, who was supposed to be the mark man on Maradona for this match, and he says something like, I'll paraphrase it, but he says something like, the difference between me and the other defenders is the fact that I am faster than Maradona, and he will never escape me, and I will never have to foul him. So at the end, it just finished a bit different for him.
Blimey, yeah. Well, yeah, so down to 10 men so early on in the game, you would think Argentina would capitalise, but of course they didn't. But the chance... But
I think that sort of tells you the mentality of that Argentina team. I'm not even sure they really tried to capitalise. I think they were so ingrained in that bunker mentality. Mm-hmm. So, they did have a couple of... There was the Ruggieri looping header early in the second half that hits the top of the bar. There's a low shot from Borushaga that Ivkovic makes quite a good save from. And then in extra time, there's the goal that's ruled out for handball, which maybe wasn't handball.
I've tried to rewatch the match again, and it's impossible to say, because all the camera angles are so bad that you just can't say if he played with his hand, but it looks like he did not.
Well, I'd like to think...
I mean, the ball sort of bounces up and it's somewhere around it might be his forearm, it might be his sort of thigh or sort of hip area. But it's Borushaga.
I'd like to think that...
But it's absolutely not clear at all.
I'd like to think that's Maradona's legacy. And I'd like to think Borushaga shouldn't be having a go at the referee, which he does. He pushes the referee, and the referee sort of threatens to take out a cut. I mean, it was a straight red now. It'd be a serious offence. And then it all kind of goes up, and the referee actually has to physically push back a couple of players. But I'd like to think Borushaga, instead of having a go at the referee, looking at Maradona and going, "That's your fault, that is. That's why that's been disallowed."
But the weird thing is that, or maybe that's just my impression, but Argentina had more chances in those 30 minutes of extra time than in the 60 minutes playing with 10 men, with 11 men against 10 men.
Yeah.
So they pushed a little bit more especially in the second extra time. But
I mean, that's understandable, right? As the 10 men get more and more tired,
of course,
the 11 men start to take control.
But I think it's important to say that Yugoslavia played very well in the defense, especially because it's not Yugoslav style of football again. European Brazilians are not playing like that. And the fact is that one of the biggest problems, even nowadays, with Balkan teams is the lack of discipline at the back and the lack of tactical organization. And in this match, they had all that tactical discipline and discipline at the back. And Spasic had a very good match, and Brnovic, who replaced Shabanajovic as a markman on Maradona, had a very good match. So I think, obviously, there was more than 50 fouls, I think, in 120 minutes.
Yeah.
But I think the way Yugoslavia played neutralized Argentina as well.
Yeah, definitely. When was that great chance? Was it Savicevic? I can't remember who hit one over the bar from about 8 yards out or something.
It was in a mid second half.
Because he came on after about an hour. But they looked...
Stojkovic crossed from the right, and he was all by himself in a box, and he blasted it in row Z.
Yeah, and it was also a shame, but the looks on the coaches' faces and Savicevic, they looked absolutely bereft. They looked absolutely gutted that he'd missed that chance, which of course, down to 10 men, what an opportunity. But it wasn't to be.
Again, one important thing to emphasize is the fact that Savicevic had a terrible game after he came on.
Yeah.
He was probably the worst player on the pitch. And again, the big issue before the World Cup was him not playing enough. And there was a story that Arkan is trying to lobby his way into the team by pressuring Osim and all the things like that. But at the end, he was probably one of the worst players on the pitch on that day.
Arkan, just for people who don't know, he goes on to become this sort of notorious warlord during the war. But at the time, he was he the leader or just a senior figure in the
one of the senior figures.
The fan group.
Incredible. Gentlemen, let's go to the penalty shootout, shall we? Because that's really what the
Do we have to?
I'm so sorry. You have the...
Jonathan said that he had listened to the penalties on the radio, and I had to do the same because I was 6 years old, and before the war in Yugoslavia, we had this holiday thing where all the schools and all the preschools took their kids to the holiday home on the seaside. So I've spent a week without my parents. I was 6, and I spent a week without my parents and only with my friends and the ladies that were working in a kindergarten. So I was watching the first 60 minutes, and after that they forced us into the bus because we had to go home. It was Saturday, I think, and I was listening for the extra time and the penalties on the radio as well in the bus on the what we call Mediterranean highway.
Okay, very nice. Presumably, you were listening in a local language rather than the German one that Jonathan was having to kind of muddle his way through. Well, I watched the actual penalties, as I say, and it had. I mean, straight from the off, really, it was one of the most extraordinary penalty shooters. Now, I know nowadays, I can think of this season even Milan going to Rio Ave in Portugal, which was an extraordinary penalty shootout, and you can think of a few penalties when they kind of go all the way through and the goalkeepers take, and there's a lot of misses, or Italy against Germany in was it the Euros in 2016, which was quite an interesting shootout as well. But of course, back in those days, there weren't many penalty shootouts at all, and penalties, they were expected. In my mind, you were expected to score a penalty more back then than you are now. I know that could just be my odd interpretation of events. But this penalty shootout, Saša, again, it just kind of, there were so many twists and turns. It went one way and then the other. It must have been, well, you didn't watch the game, but for most people in Yugoslavia, it must have been,
the weird
quite
thing
nerve-wracking.
with penalties. The weird thing with penalties in Yugoslavia is the fact that we had penalties every week. Because in late 80s, after the many match fixing scandals in Yugoslav League, one of the rules was that they had to take penalties if the match finished with a draw. So you take only 1 point if you win on the penalties.
Yeah.
So we had penalties every week, and I've seen a bunch of penalties in my childhood.
Yeah, so kind of used to it.
But this shootout was very weird and very strange. I think both goalkeepers were very self-confident because Tomislav Ivkovic, he already had saved once against Maradona, and he keeps telling this story like every time you talk to him, twice. So it's huge thing for him, and at the time it was huge thing for him because he was so convinced that he can be the key player in this shootout. And on the other hand, you had a Gojkovic who was very good at the penalties as well.
Yeah.
While Yugoslavia had this problem with they missed the penalty against Colombia, as I mentioned before, so the players are a bit shaky, and then obviously they played with 10 men for 90 minutes, so they must have been much more tired or more tired than Argentinians. And we must say that at the time they played in Florence, and at the time it was like 40 degrees.
Yeah. So yeah, conditions were quite tricky. Well, and of course, the game being in Florence, you would fully expect the home crowd to be more behind Yugoslavia with the Maradona factor and so on and so forth. But Jonathan, the penalty shootout begins, and Argentina go 1-0 up, and then Stojkovic steps up, the kind of the main man himself, and he crashes his penalty against the bar, which again one can easily sort of with hindsight look back and think, oh blimey, but that is not a confidence booster for a side when their most sort of one of their most technically gifted players doesn't slot his penalty away.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the logic when you're drawing up your order of penalty takers is put the dead cert first, make sure you score your first one, and Stojkovic would have been.
Yeah.
I mean, both in terms of technical ability, in terms of personality, he's the person you would trust to score it. And yeah, you look at it hitting the bar, and it's almost like he's tried to be too precise. So yeah, suddenly they're 1-0 down, but then Trollio misses his, hits the post, so it's 1-1. Oh, sorry.
No. Burruchaga scores for 2-0. Yeah.
But Burruchaga and then Prosinecki score.
But then Maradona's penalty it's a terrible penalty. It's an awful penalty.
It was a wonderful moment for the neutral. Let's be honest.
And again, there's a story from Tomislav Ivkovic who says that he said to Maradona that he will save that penalty, that he will catch the ball, and that he will go to his right side, to Ivkovic's right side. So, yeah, that's the anecdote he's keep telling us.
Yeah,
and then Trollio hits the post, and so suddenly the advantage is with Yugoslavia, and Brnovic has a chance to win it with the fifth penalty.
But there's a twist in that, because Faruk Hadžibegić goes to the penalty box, and he's the one who takes penalties for Yugoslavia for the last couple of years. So he scored 6 or 7 out of 8, and that 8-1 was against Colombia. So he missed against Colombia when Higuita saved it. But 7 penalties before that, he scored. So he takes the ball, he puts the ball on the spot, but then the ref whistles he whistles and he goes to the middle of the pitch. But we can't see what's happening because the director of the broadcast puts the camera on Argentinian team for some reason or something like that. So the next thing that happens is that Dragoljub Brnovic is going to the box. So they switched the player. Was it because Brnovic was on the list before Hadžibegić? Probably. So he had to switch. But Hadžibegić was the one who was supposed to take that penalty first.
That's interesting. I mean, yeah, it's funny because I can remember the commentator, I think it was on the BBC, when he goes to take the penalty. I mean, he hits it sort of into the corner, but it's not really well struck. And for a goalkeeper like Gojkovic, he's obviously going to eat that up. But I can remember the commentator saying, "Oh, dearie me, that was one of the most nervous penalties I've ever seen." And that
it was a terrible penalty. Hit by the ground, but it was like the slowest penalty I've ever seen.
Yeah, and so it remains 2-2, and then you're essentially into a sudden death bit, and Dazzotti puts his penalty away. And then, of course, in the final penalty, Goycochea does what he does best in penalty shootouts, Jonathan. He's the hero, and Argentina go through.
That's actually the first really good save. In a shootout in which not many penalties are scored. It's the first one where you'd say, yeah, the keeper's actually done some work there. That Hadzibegic hits it relatively firmly. I guess the height is decent for Goycochea. But it's towards the post, and he dives and saves it, and Goycochea's legacy is secure. Indeed. I mean, he secures it further in the semi-final when he does exactly the same to Italy.
Yeah.
And Yugoslavia out and never to be seen at the World Cup again.
Yeah. In the same time, the pressure on Hadzibegic must have been huge because he was supposed to take the penalty for the win, and all of a sudden he was taken back and then takes the penalty to stay in the game. And he misses it.
Well, but that.
So what? So Saša, what do you think?
But that penalty wouldn't have been for the win. Sorry, that would have made it 3-2.
So it wouldn't be for the win, but it would be definitely easier to take the penalty, and that would give you an advantage. Of course, in the last years.
And so, as Jonathan says, Yugoslavia were out of the World Cup and never to sort of be seen again in that. With that side and under that banner, I suppose, Saša. Really, how is this team looked at then? Years on from this, we've seen the Yugoslavia now split up. Of course, we've seen Croatia reach 2 World Cup finals. Absolutely extraordinary achievement. We've seen Serbia and Montenegro perform as a collective at the tournaments. Slovenia as well. But how is this side viewed by people living in the Balkans when they look back on it?
As the biggest myth and the biggest legend ever, because obviously when you stop in this way, forced to stop your development and evolution, there must be a myth that this is the biggest side ever. Even though I'm not sure about it, but the fact that they won the World Cup, Youth World Cup in 1987 in Chile, and that the core of that team stayed on top of their game for the next 5, 6, 7, 8 years, and that the core of that team was part of Croatian team that won the 3rd place in France. Obviously, all this, and the fact that Ivica Osim is after that considered as one of the biggest or one of the most important coaches in the history of the country. All these things mixed together create a sort of myth that this team would win the World Cup in the United States.
Yeah, just to clarify.
Sorry,
just to clarify, I should have said that when we see Croatia reach 2 World Cup finals, as in perform, exceedingly well at the 2 World Cup finals. Just to clarify. Sorry, Jonathan.
So Katanets, the line he came out with when I asked him about this said, "If a country hadn't fallen apart, I guarantee we would have crushed the world," which is one side of the argument. But then I spoke to Bilic, who obviously was part of the '98 team, Croatia team, and he was sort of saying, "Well, people say this, but look at the midfield we had. Where would you have fitted Savicevic? Where would you have fitted Stojkovic? We already had Boban and Pozanecki and Asanovic. There's no space for them. We had a team that had balance and worked. It's not as easy as just getting great players and assuming they'll work together." So, and all the internal divisions and rivalries that we've already talked about, they wouldn't have just gone away, just because they were a slightly better team. So, I think they would certainly have had a squad of players capable of doing great things. That doesn't necessarily mean that they would have done.
Indeed. Well, Saša, it's been a pleasure talking to you about this game and this incredible side from Balkans footballing history. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Pleasure was all mine.
And of course, for more stories like that, do check out theblizzard.co.uk. But until next week, thanks, Jonathan.
Cheers.
Thank you, Saša.
Cheers.
See you next week, everybody.